Ethan had been working on his community outreach program for months, and despite the mounting pressure, he felt a rare sense of accomplishment. His goal was to bridge the gap between law enforcement, firefighters, and the communities they served. He had been organizing a series of open houses, meetings, and community events that encouraged local residents to engage with first responders in a way they never had before. The program had slowly begun to gain traction, but this latest event would prove to be more than anyone had anticipated. The tension had been building for weeks. The small community where Ethan lived was divided. An undercurrent of distrust lingered between the residents and the emergency services, particularly the police. The neighborhood had a history of strained relations with the law enforcement, especially after a controversial incident months earlier, where an officer had been involved in a violent altercation with a local resident. Rumors had swirled, fueling anger, and now Ethan's outreach program was caught in the crossfire. His latest event was to be a joint open house with the police department and the fire station. A chance for families to walk through fire trucks, see police cars, and meet the officers and firefighters in a non-threatening setting. The aim was to humanize them, to break down the walls of distrust. Ethan knew that for some, this might be their only opportunity to interact with a cop or a firefighter without the looming threat of an emergency. But Ethan wasn't naive. He knew the tension between the two groups and the residents was palpable, and today, it felt like it was about to boil over. The community center, where the event was being held, had been transformed. Balloons and banners hung from every corner, welcoming families. Firefighters in their full gear stood next to police officers in uniforms, ready to talk to anyone who approached them. Ethan paced back and forth, glancing out the large windows, watching as the first few attendees trickled in. His chest tightened. He knew today could either be a breakthrough or a disaster. The first sign that something was wrong came when a group of local teenagers, all from a neighborhood known for its high crime rate, arrived. They were loud, aggressive, their faces hardened by years of resentment towards the police. They stood at the entrance, eyeing the officers with open hostility. Ethan approached them cautiously, trying to play the peacemaker. "Hey, guys, welcome. Thanks for coming. This is a chance to see the work these people do for us. It's all about building trust, you know?" One of the teens, a tall, lean boy named Marcus, looked Ethan up and down before sneering. "Trust? You want us to trust them?" Marcus jerked his thumb toward the police officers who were standing by the entrance, clearly nervous under the scrutiny of the teenagers. Ethan could feel his heart racing. "Look, Marcus, I get it. I know there's history. But we have to start somewhere, right? You don't have to love them, but at least talk to them, hear their side." The teen scoffed. "Their side? You mean the side where they throw people like me in jail for no reason?" He exchanged a knowing look with his friends, who snickered. Before Ethan could respond, a woman stormed into the room. Her name was Carla, and she was an outspoken community activist who had long been critical of the police force. She was well known in the area for organizing protests, and her presence at the event had Ethan's stomach churning. "What the hell is this?" she shouted, her voice cutting through the hum of conversations. "This is a joke, right? You're letting the same cops who harass our kids into our homes?" She turned, her gaze sweeping across the officers who had begun to step back. Carla's words had stung. She was not wrong in many residents' eyes. But Ethan was caught between wanting to defend the officers and his own understanding of the community's pain. Before anyone could respond, Another unexpected scene erupted. One of the younger officers, a rookie named Luke, who had been with the department for only a few months, approached Marcus. With wide, uncertain eyes, he tried to speak to the teenager, but the words came out too quickly, too awkwardly. "Hey, Marcus, I know it's hard to trust us, but, we're really just here to help. You know, if you ever need—" The teenager cut him off, pushing Luke's chest with one hand. "Shut up. Just shut up." Marcus' voice was steady but venomous, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. The tension hung thick in the air. "Hey!" shouted another voice, a woman from the local church who had been trying to mediate. "This is not the place for violence, young man." But her words only seemed to fuel the fire. A few more people from the crowd began to gather around, sensing the impending confrontation. Luke stumbled back, and his face flushed with embarrassment. Ethan rushed over to calm the situation, but before he could speak, Marcus' friend, a larger teenager with a deep voice, spoke out. "You know, my cousin was shot by a cop last year. They're all the same." His words hit like a thunderclap. The entire room seemed to go silent, the weight of the accusations suffocating the atmosphere. Ethan's mind raced. "Wait, what?" he asked, trying to process. "Who was shot?" When the teen's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You don't even know? Doesn't surprise me. They never tell you the truth, do they?" The tension in the room escalated, and now the officers were visibly rattled. One of the senior officers, an older man named Lieutenant Harris, stepped forward, his face hard and unforgiving. "This is not the time or place for these kinds of accusations," he said, his voice low but authoritative. "If you have an issue, you take it up with the department. This event is about building communication, not tearing us down." But the damage had already been done. The room, which had started as a hopeful gathering, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The whispers began, spreading like wildfire. Someone in the back of the room mentioned the shooting, others questioned the integrity of the officers. Carla was already on her phone, organizing a protest, her voice a battle cry. Then, in the midst of this chaos, a shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. Officer Luke, still shaken, grabbed the microphone that had been set up for speeches and, with trembling hands, began speaking, his words slow but deliberate. I want to say something. There's been something I've been hiding." Everyone turned toward him, the crowd now eerily quiet. "Last year, I was involved in an incident. A mistake. I didn't report it, and it's been eating me up inside." Gasps rippled through the room. Ethan's stomach dropped. He had no idea what Luke was about to reveal. I had a confrontation with someone. A local kid. Things got out of hand. I shouldn't have used force. I should have called for backup, but I didn't. And the kid didn't make it." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession sinking in like a stone. "His name was Luke added, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been living with that guilt every single day since." The room felt like it was about to collapse in on itself. The revelation hit everyone hard, but for some, it only deepened the divide. Ethan's heart raced. He had not prepared for this moment. The whole purpose of today's event had been to build trust, but now, it felt as if the very foundation had been shattered. The crowd was divided, some were in shock, others enraged. Before anyone could process what Luke had said, a large group of residents stormed out, shouting obscenities and accusations. The activists, led by Carla, now had their own platform. And what had started as an outreach event aimed at building unity had instead ignited a firestorm of anger, betrayal, and grief. Ethan stood in the middle of the chaos, his mind reeling, unsure whether the damage could ever be undone. Today, the cracks between the community, the police, and the firefighters had been exposed more painfully than he could have imagined. What began as a hopeful step towards healing had become a brutal confrontation that no one would soon forget. The aftermath of the event had left Ethan in a state of disbelief. The community outreach program, which he had poured his heart into, had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Officer Luke's confession had unleashed a flood of anger and frustration, and the community was now more divided than ever. Some saw Luke's words as a brave acknowledgement of the truth, while others saw it as an admission of guilt, a sign of deep corruption within the police force. The activists led by Carla had already gathered a group outside the community center, chanting for justice and demanding accountability. Ethan could only watch as the chaos unfolded around him, his chest tight with frustration. But it wasn't over yet. The next day, Ethan was scheduled to attend a panel discussion on police reform at a local university. The discussion had been set up as part of his ongoing outreach effort, an attempt to bring together community leaders, activists, and local law enforcement to address the growing tension. After the disastrous events of the open house, Ethan wasn't sure if he could face the public again, but he knew he had no choice. The pressure was on. The community was watching, and they wanted answers. The university auditorium was packed. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone knew the event would be anything but ordinary. Ethan arrived early, his stomach in knots, and took his seat at the long table alongside several local officials, including Lieutenant Harris, Carla, and a few other community leaders. The panel was to be moderated by a well-known journalist from the local news station, who had been outspoken about the issues surrounding the police department. As the panel began, the journalist started with soft questions, attempting to ease into the conversation. Ethan, thank you for joining us today. Your community outreach program is being hailed as an important step toward mending the fractured relationship between the police and the community. What do you believe is the most urgent change that needs to happen? Ethan cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. Thank you for having me. The most urgent change, in my opinion, is trust. There's a real divide in this community, and it's rooted in years of fear, misunderstanding, and yes, sometimes outright violence. We need to start having real conversations, building relationships. It's not just about policy changes, it's about changing the way people perceive one another. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience, and Ethan felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this panel could help steer the conversation in the right direction. But then, just as the journalist was about to ask Lieutenant Harris a question, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. She couldn't have been older than 25, with sharp features and an intense gaze. Ethan recognized her immediately. She was Maya, a prominent local activist who had been vocal in her criticism of the police department. He had seen her at protests, heard her name in the news. She wasn't one to mince words. The journalist gestured for her to speak, and Maya stood up, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. I don't want to hear more platitudes about building trust and changing perceptions. You've had years to do that, Ethan. So tell me, why should we believe that this time is different? What's actually changing? Because from where I stand, all I see is a bunch of cops hiding behind outreach programs while people like Luke, who are clearly unfit to serve, continue to wear badges. A gasp ran through the crowd, and all eyes turned to Ethan. He could feel his pulse quicken. The weight of Maya's accusation was undeniable. She wasn't just questioning the program, she was questioning his integrity. Ethan took a deep breath, but Maya wasn't done. Do you know how many kids in this neighborhood have been stopped by the police for looking suspicious? Do you know how many families have had to bury their loved ones because of police violence? Don't tell me about trust when you've failed us time and time again. You and your program aren't going to fix a system that was designed to oppress people like us. The words stung. Ethan knew she was speaking to the heart of the problem. He had spent so much time focused on the details of his outreach efforts, open houses, community dinners, panels like this one, that he hadn't fully addressed the deep-seated anger and fear that had been building in the community for decades. Maya's words were an accusation not just against the police, but against him. Lieutenant Harris, clearly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat. Maya, no one is denying the mistakes that have been made. But we're here to have a constructive conversation. The idea behind this program isn't to sweep those issues under the rug. It's to begin a process of accountability, and we're committed to that. Luke made a mistake, and he's facing consequences. Maya scoffed, her eyes narrowing. Consequences? What consequences? A slap on the wrist? A few training sessions? You really think that's enough? Ethan could feel the room tense as Maya's words gained traction. She wasn't wrong. People were angry. They had seen the same promises made for years, only for them to be broken time and again. The pressure in the room was mounting, and Ethan knew that if he didn't address her directly, the entire panel would fall apart. I understand your frustration, Maya, Ethan said, his voice steady, though he could feel the heat rising in his chest. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm not here to promise miracles. But I believe that without this kind of engagement, without showing up, without showing that we're willing to listen, we'll never make progress. Yes, the system is flawed. Yes, there have been terrible mistakes. But we can't change anything by pretending those issues don't exist. Maya's lip curled into a disdainful smile. You're right. The system is flawed. But don't act like you're some hero just because you're giving us a platform to talk. The truth is, these programs are just a distraction. You're not addressing the real problems. You're not talking about the racist policies that exist within your department. You're not talking about the training that encourages officers to treat people like criminals before they even speak to them. You're not talking about the officers who feel like they're above the law because they're part of an institution that shields them from accountability. The audience was silent now, hanging on Maya's every word. The air was thick with tension. Ethan's face burned with humiliation, but he refused to back down. I'm not pretending that these issues don't exist, Maya. But I do believe that real change starts with dialogue. It starts with people being willing to look each other in the eye, even when they're uncomfortable. We can't move forward by just pointing fingers. Maya took a step closer to the microphone, her voice rising. You're right, but I don't think you're ready to do what it takes to make real change. What you're offering is a band-aid on a bullet wound. Before Ethan could respond, a chorus of murmurs broke out among the audience. The room was divided. Half of them were nodding in agreement with Maya, while others seemed to lean toward Ethan's stance. The heat in the room was suffocating, and the moderator tried to steer the conversation back to a more neutral ground, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Maya had successfully painted Ethan, and by extension his outreach program, as ineffective, a mere tool of the system rather than a force for real change. Ethan's mind was racing. He had never anticipated the hostility of this panel. It was supposed to be a space for open dialogue, but it had quickly turned into an interrogation. The tension was unbearable, the stakes higher than he had ever imagined. The conversation would go on, but Ethan knew that the questions of trust, accountability, and reform were far from settled. In fact, they were just beginning. After the panel discussion, Ethan felt more defeated than he had in months. Maya's pointed questions had shaken him to his core. The community was angry, and rightly so. The outreach program that had once seemed like a beacon of hope was now being called a facade, a mere distraction from the real issues. Ethan had spent so much time on the surface-level initiatives, open houses, meetings, dinners, but he had ignored the deeper issues: systemic racism, institutional bias, the need for real accountability. The words of activists like Maya rang in his ears, accusing him of offering only shallow fixes when the community needed something far more substantial. Still, he couldn't back down. He couldn't let the program collapse under the weight of one bad event. He knew that if the outreach was going to survive, he had to push for real, lasting change. Ethan began to research the best practices for police and firefighter reform. He dug into studies, read books, consulted with experts. What he found was both simple and profound: cultural competency and bias training. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was a start. And it had to be more than just a few sessions of talking. It needed to be immersive. It needed to force officers and firefighters to confront their own biases, their own preconceived notions about race, class, and power. He proposed the idea to Lieutenant Harris first. The older officer was skeptical at best. "Ethan, you're asking us to teach people about things we don't even know ourselves. How is this supposed to change anything?" Harris had been a fixture in the department for decades, and he was resistant to any notion of reform that wasn't rooted in the tried-and-true methods of policing. The younger officers, like Luke, were more open, but they had little experience with the kinds of in-depth, emotionally charged exercises Ethan was pushing for. Still, Ethan pushed forward. He arranged for outside experts to come in, specialists in diversity and cultural competency, who would lead role-playing exercises designed to put the officers and firefighters into real-world situations where they would have to make difficult decisions under pressure. He also arranged for these sessions to involve community members, especially people from neighborhoods that had historically been targeted by law enforcement. The idea was simple: put the responders in the shoes of the community, make them experience the fear, the frustration, the anger, and the hope that so many residents felt when interacting with the police and firefighters. The first training session took place in a large conference room at the fire station. It wasn't as many people as Ethan had hoped. Several officers had opted out, and some of the senior firefighters refused to attend. But it was a start. The room was tense, a mix of apprehension and skepticism hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ethan stood at the front, alongside the trainer, a woman named Dr. Linda Bryant, who was an expert in racial and cultural studies. She looked around the room at the officers and firefighters, each one shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Bryant began with a lecture about implicit bias, how everyone, no matter their background, carried biases they might not even be aware of. She emphasized how these biases could affect decision-making in high-pressure situations. As she spoke, Lieutenant Harris's arms were crossed, his face stony, but he remained silent. Luke, on the other hand, sat at the edge of his seat, nodding along. Then came the role-playing exercises. The first scenario was simple, a routine traffic stop. Dr. Bryant played the role of a black man in a car, and one of the officers played the role of the cop pulling him over. The goal was to simulate the experience of being stopped, frisked, and questioned by a police officer, with all the tension and fear that might come from being a person of color in that situation. The room fell silent as the role play unfolded. The officer who played the cop asked questions curtly, his tone more aggressive than necessary. Dr. Bryant responded with a blend of fear and defiance, her body language stiff as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The officer seemed to grow frustrated as Dr. Bryant didn't immediately comply with his orders, but then he was asked to switch places with her. Now, the officer was asked to be the person of color in the car, and Dr. Bryant played the role of the officer. Suddenly, everything changed. The officer's posture stiffened, and his eyes darted nervously around the room as Dr. Bryant moved toward him. The moment the officer stepped into the shoes of the black man, everything shifted. He experienced firsthand the uncertainty and fear that many black and brown people felt during these interactions. His hands trembled as he reached into his bag for his ID. When the scenario ended, there was a long pause in the room. The officer who had been in the role of the black man spoke first. "I had no idea," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't realize how small you feel when you're on the other side of that." Dr. Bryant nodded solemnly. "That's the point of this exercise. To make you see things from another person's perspective." Luke, the rookie officer, looked at her with genuine curiosity. "And how do we change that? What's the next step?" Dr. Bryant smiled, but her eyes were intense. "The next step is acknowledging that bias exists in you, and then learning how to recognize it in the moment, how to check it. You have to confront it every time. It's not easy, but it's the only way forward." The next scenario involved a firefighter responding to a call in a predominantly low-income, Hispanic neighborhood. The firefighters were asked to respond to a situation where a child had been injured during a violent altercation. The scenario included language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the kind of tension that often existed between responders and families in these neighborhoods. The firefighter who took on the role of the responding firefighter struggled with the language barrier. He attempted to communicate with the child's mother, but his frustration with not being able to understand her quickly turned to irritation. The woman's responses were sharp, and it was clear that the mother was already wary of the firefighters. This role-playing scenario forced the firefighters to recognize their own biases against a community that they assumed was ungrateful or difficult to work with. When the roles were reversed, the firefighter who had played the community member began to express what it felt like to be viewed with suspicion and even contempt, even in moments of crisis. When the exercise was over, one firefighter spoke up. "I didn't think we could ever make any progress in neighborhoods like that. It just felt like they were always angry, always resistant. But now I understand why. It wasn't perfect. The session was uncomfortable. Some of the officers and firefighters still seemed resistant to the exercises. Lieutenant Harris, especially, had remained aloof, not fully engaging in any of the role-play scenarios. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan saw a glimmer of something. The cracks in the wall were beginning to form. The officers and firefighters were starting to acknowledge their own biases, even if they were reluctant to fully accept them. The next session, held a week later, was slightly better. More officers showed up, and some of the senior firefighters who had previously opted out decided to attend. Luke, who had been the most receptive, continued to ask questions, eager to learn and adapt. There was no sudden transformation, but there was progress. The conversations started shifting. Officers began questioning their own behaviors, and firefighters started to talk more openly about the prejudices they had experienced in the communities they served. But then, as always, there was a twist. Maya, the activist from the earlier panel, attended one of the later sessions. Ethan wasn't sure what to expect from her this time. Would she denounce these efforts as another hollow attempt at reform? Would she call it performative? But when the session ended, Maya approached him. "I didn't think you had it in you," she said quietly. "But this is a step in the right direction. It's not enough yet, but it's a start." The words were unexpected. Maya had been one of his harshest critics, and her acknowledgement of the training's potential felt like a small victory in the midst of a battle that was far from over. The road ahead would be long, filled with skepticism and resistance, but Ethan knew one thing for sure: the real work had only just begun. The day of the Community and Police Symposium had arrived, and Ethan stood backstage, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The room was filled with the city's leaders, community activists, police officers, and firefighters, all of them gathered to hear his keynote speech. After months of organizing, training, and navigating the deep divide between law enforcement and the community, Ethan knew this was his moment to prove that change was not only possible, but necessary. The auditorium was packed, its size a constant reminder of the stakes. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of skepticism, anger, and curiosity. Maya, the activist who had become a thorn in his side, sat in the front row with her arms crossed. Her presence alone reminded him that many saw this event as just another attempt to placate the community. Lieutenant Harris was there too, seated stiffly near the back, his face hard as stone. The department had made strides since the last training sessions, but there was still a significant amount of resistance from the higher-ups. As Ethan made his way to the stage, the murmurs of the crowd seemed to quiet, but only slightly. The spotlight was blinding, and for a moment, he was unsure if he could even speak. He glanced down at his notes, but the words felt meaningless. Instead, he took a deep breath and decided to speak from the heart. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady but tense. "I stand before you, not as someone with all the answers, but as someone who believes in the possibility of change. We are here today because of the wounds that have been inflicted on this community, wounds that have been caused by fear, mistrust, and, yes, racism. It's hard to ignore these facts, and we should never pretend they don't exist." There was a stir in the audience, some nodding in agreement, others bristling at the mention of racism. Ethan felt the unease, but he pressed on. "We can't change what has happened in the past, but we can change what happens next. This isn't about empty promises, and it isn't about asking you to simply forgive. It's about committing to a process of cultural transformation that requires us to examine our biases, our behaviors, and our beliefs." He could see Maya's eyes narrow, and it was clear she wasn't buying what he was selling. But he continued, undeterred. Since we began our community outreach program, we've introduced cultural competency and bias training. It's not enough, and it will never be enough until we see real results. But the most important thing is that we are trying. We are acknowledging that things need to change. But it's not just about police reform. It's about all of us, police officers, firefighters, activists, community members, coming together and doing the hard work of breaking down the barriers that divide us. Maya stood up abruptly, cutting through his speech with a harsh voice. You think this is enough? Do you think we can forget years of discrimination with a few training sessions and speeches? You can't just say we're trying and expect that to change anything. People are dying, Ethan. People are still being brutalized. The room went silent, and the tension escalated. Ethan felt the weight of her accusation hanging in the air. He knew she was right. Saying, "We're trying," didn't make up for the real pain, the real lives that had been affected. But he had to keep going. "No, Maya. You're right," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the room, unwavering. "It's not enough. It will never be enough until we address the systemic issues that have plagued this community for generations. But this is the start. This is the moment when we say enough is enough. I'm asking for your commitment, not just for today, but for the long haul. This is a journey that won't be easy, and one that we can't take alone." Maya's expression softened slightly, but her posture remained defiant. She hadn't been won over, but that wasn't what mattered. Ethan had learned long ago that change didn't come from speeches alone. It came from action, from following through on the promises made. Police officers need to be better, Ethan continued. Firefighters need to be better. We all need to be better. But the first step is acknowledging that we can, and we must, do better for the sake of this community. He glanced over at Lieutenant Harris, who was still silent, his eyes unreadable. Ethan knew that the department's culture couldn't change overnight, but the fact that they were sitting in the same room as activists like Maya spoke volumes. "I know we have a long way to go," Ethan said, his voice softer now, more reflective. "But we are making progress. Change will come, even if it's slow. And it will come because we're not giving up. We're not pretending that this isn't difficult. It is. But if we can come together, if we can keep having these difficult conversations, then maybe, just maybe, we can start to heal." The crowd sat in silence for a long moment. Ethan felt his words settle in the room, unsure of their impact. Some faces were skeptical, others thoughtful. Maya, though, looked almost resigned, as if her anger had dissipated, replaced with something deeper, more complicated. "I'm not asking you to forgive," Ethan said, his voice steady and strong. "I'm asking you to keep showing up. For the officers, for the community, for the future of this city. If we don't show up, nothing will ever change. If we don't show up, the divide will only grow wider." There was a long pause. Then, unexpectedly, Lieutenant Harris stood up, his voice surprisingly soft for a man who had been so resistant to change. "We're committed to this," Harris said, looking around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of the community members. "We're committed to doing the work. But it's not just on us. It's on all of us. We have to hold each other accountable. We have to make sure this isn't just another speech. This is the real deal. If you're here for change, then we're with you." The words weren't a full endorsement, but they were the first step in what Ethan hoped would be a long, difficult journey. There was still much to be done. Bias and cultural competency training would continue, police reform would be debated, and tensions would persist. But in that moment, the room felt different. The divide between the community and law enforcement had not been erased, but a bridge had been built. Maya didn't stand up to protest again. She stayed seated, her arms still crossed, but her expression was less hostile. For Ethan, that was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He knew that the fight for justice and transformation was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Change, he believed, was possible, but it would take everyone's effort, and it would take time.